Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you from Film Fanatic headquarters. Hope everyone's doing good. It's another pretty cold, wintry day, wintry morning. It's about 9:30 on a Thursday morning. Hope everyone's doing good. I want to thank everybody again for supporting this channel. It's been cool. The likes, people have been commenting more and more almost every day now. Like, I've been getting new comments and interacting with different people who are checking out this channel and seem to be fans of this channel. Other fellow film fanatics, if you will. So that's great. That's the whole point, is to like get somewhat of a discussion around some of these films that I'm posting. And at the end of the day, it's always about movies, bringing movies that I love and cherish to the table, but then also maybe bringing a little bit of a light onto, films that not many folks have seen, or that are, films that are kind of on the obscure side of things. That's kind of the focus of the channel. So when there's a dialogue around a particular film that's, that I kind of consider pretty obscure, it's awesome because I had one gentleman just a few days ago, who had just recently subscribed to the channel, and he said that he was not familiar with a lot of these movies, but he really loved this channel, really liked this channel, and checks out the videos almost daily. And he said that he makes these little lists, and he's obviously a big fan of horror films. We have like a lot of the same interests, but he loves, taking a little bit of a deep dive and exploring that world, especially the exploitation world, and, coming across a new discovery. And to me, that's where it's at. Like, that's awesome. For me, that's fuel to keep this channel going. Because also for me, it's the same, I have that same reaction, because a lot of the films lately that I've been posting have been movies I've never seen before, but I've been buying them kind of on a whim, taking more of a risk and a little bit more of a chance, throwing a little bit of caution to the wind, and buying lots of movies that are kind of related to, genres that I really love, or particularly, it's usually centered particularly around certain companies that I really love. Severin, Blue Underground, Synapse, Mondo Macabre, a lot of labels that now I'm really, really familiar with, and I've bought quite a few titles in those labels. And usually the start is finding a director or a movie that I really love, and movies that I have seen, but then checking out that catalog that's also part of this company, or that particular company. So the cool thing too about, like, say, companies like Synapse, or even another company, Vinegar Syndrome, there's a whole bunch of companies, and particularly Mondo Macabre and Severin, Blue Underground. They have just an amazing collection of films, and the thing that I love about being a consumer of films, and buying, and a collector and avid fan, and watch, and I also watch all the films that I buy. The track record is just awesome. They have, the level of consistency is just pretty much through the roof. So usually with that being said, when I'm buying movies, like lately I've been buying a lot of movies that I've never seen before. Their track record is so good that, and the consistency is there. So I really luck out, and that's usually what I do now, because with taking more of a chance of buying movies that I have never seen, or coming and discovering lots of directors that I've never heard of. It's been wonderful. It's been just like, this world has been here, and now it's even more expansive. So, and the other day, like, this gentleman who just subscribed to the channel kind of he commented on one of the videos, and basically saying that he's a big fan of horror. He seems to really love this channel, and he checks out a lot of videos. A lot of the movies he's never heard of. So he's been making these lists and checking them out, and getting this information. And really digging that. And that's kind of the main focus of the channel, is to try to bring some new things, uh, of an older style, a bygone era, that all these underground gems that were never, they might not have really have seen the light of day, or if they did, it was a very, very tiny little, they had a little bit of a stage to shine for a really brief time, if that. So that's really the main, I guess you could say, the main passion behind this channel. And when I have those interactions with people, that really just fuels me even more to dive into this whole world even more. And I just love it. So thanks again for people who are, caring about things like that, because I feel like for me it's not only is it a hobby of mine, but it's a real deep passion, and it is a you know kind of a lifestyle for me. It's kind of a these films are such a huge part of my DNA and the whole aesthetic around it, and it's tremendously influential on the weird music that I create for my band Quantum. We I feel like as well, alongside the obvious things around certain bands and albums that I really cherish and love, that are deep influences on the music that I create or that I write for Quantum. It's really the films of this world and everything around that is definitely the biggest influence on what I write. It's really the outlet that I have. And I've talked about that before, where years ago I've dabbled in filmmaking. I've done a little bit of I've worn a few hats in that world. I started off years ago directing. I had some experience many years ago directing these short little music videos. And for a band that I was in at the time, we kind of were very much into the Velvet Underground. They were a huge inspiration. They're kind of one of my favorite rock bands even to this day. But in particularly, their whole thing, like their aesthetic, their visual aesthetic, was a real big influence on a band that I was playing in back many years ago called Full Contact Kitty. So we were very much inspired by Velvet Underground's work with Andy Warhol uh, at the factory, where they would do all of these kind of legendary performances, and they would have these various kind of, I guess you could consider them, but art house videos or art house films and experimental films projected on the band while they were performing. And that to me was always a really cool attraction, and I always thought that was one of the coolest things that a band could do. I was always, that discovery was, I just think, such a cool thing, and that really influenced our band and our sound, particularly early on with Full Contact Kitty. So that got me into making videos, and we kind of followed that same thing, where we after I shot a bunch of videos, we for a bunch of performances, we started projecting. We'd bring a little camera, an actual camera projector, and we would set it up on a little tripod and then have it projected on the band. That's kind of where that started. And then after that, I kept doing that kind of work for a while, and then and the band itself, Full Contact Kitty, used that kind of medium, or that way of showcasing the band, for about a few years, maybe 2 to 3 years. And it was really cool. We had a good run with that aspect of the band, and eventually we moved into doing even more theatrical things with around stage makeup and masks and costumes and lighting, and real subtle but elaborate setups at the same time, to where it would kind of create a certain vibe. And we were all very much influenced by movies. And then fast forward years later, I had the desire to try to get into actually maybe becoming a film director. And then over time, I did I had a project, and I did shoot a film. It was a short film, and it was this movie called Rapture, and it was a short little vampire movie, and it was about, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes long. Basically, I shot it here at my house. I shot it around town. I shot all of the outdoor scenes, and we used a few different locations in Belfast. And I worked with a few different local actors, and we shot it over a period of, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks. We would block off certain weekends, and we did it that way, usually on Saturdays. And I worked with Vince Gabriel, otherwise known as Lucky Fool on Facebook. Really good friend, just a local legend of a musician. He had just gotten these GoPro cameras, and he had a pretty nice setup. So we collaborated. We did that whole project together, and then we shot it, and then we ended up, working on it for a very long time, and then we ended up having a showing of the movie at Aarhus Gallery, which was a really cool gallery in Belfast quite a few years ago that doesn't exist, unfortunately, anymore. And it was a really cool, like, kind of modern art gallery that showed a lot of, I don't know, I feel like modern pieces of art, but then it had a real contemporary flavor to it. It was owned and run by, in a cooperative way. So there was like five to 10 different artists that were helping run that place, and they had a lot of edgy material. It wasn't just paintings of lobster boats or lighthouses. It wasn't a gallery that was catered to, say, just tourists. So they had some legitimately really cool things in there, and they had music at one point in there. They would have lots of concerts. I got to play in there with other bands over the years, and it was always a really great place. And we had the showing of Rapture there. We had like a premiere there, and it was a great experience doing that whole movie. I mean, it was a tremendous amount of work. It gave me a whole new profound respect for filmmaking and how hard it really is, and how costly it is, how consuming it is. But just filmmaking itself, I feel, and I've always felt this way, but especially after I tried doing it, in my, actually making it a thing, I came to the conclusion that, being a filmmaker or a director, I feel, is probably the most complicated art form that there is, because you're in that cockpit, and you're the captain of that ship, and you're focused on directing this movie, bringing your ideas and your vision to light. But along with that, you have to wear like multiple hats. So you're worrying about 10,000 things at once. You're worrying about just getting the actors and the scheduling scenarios around that. You're worrying about the design, the cinematography of how something should be shot. You're worrying about like the costumes, how the look of each character should be. You're worrying about the music, the score, the songs that would be used, the editing process, and the locations that you're using, and also trying to get a performance that you feel is what you need for each character. You're multitasking at such a high level, and it's kind of insane. But I feel like it's the most complex medium that there is. And every time you're on set, you're like wearing 10,000 different hats. Like, you're constantly trying to think about all these different things, and then having to take all those things on. And granted, what we did was like completely, small potatoes. But it gave me a newfound respect on how hard it actually is to make a film in a lot of ways, and also the amount of work that's put into it, and the financial cost, and also the financial burden of how how you make these things work, and then to, if you have a final product, what, what, and then looking into and what how you navigate trying to get people to see your film. So it gave me a whole deeper appreciation for film. It made me actually fall in love with film even more because of that process. And looking back, the movie is, Rapture is, well, put it mildly, is a piece of shit. And it was my first time directing a movie. I had, quite a bit of experience before that doing video, which is two different things. There's lots of similarities, but it was my first time doing a movie. And so, granted, everybody's got their rough starts, when they're jumping into a particular genre or a style of, or art. But it was, it's something I have never really shown to other people other than I've never had any of their openings. Occasionally I'll show it to a friend who's here, or, as a kind of a joke. It's nothing that I'm proud. I'm proud of the experience, and I'm really glad that I went through that experience and that I got a chance to do it. I'm not proud of the movie. I think it's pretty bad, but it was what it was, and I learned a lot. I really did. I learned a lot, and after that, I had this other desire to make other films, and I had these other projects. Two projects in particular that I were, pretty much at one point were ready to go, and had started actually filming, and wrote this new script. And I had written a bunch of different drafts for this script. I started collaborating with other people, and I was working on this one film project that was going to be, Rapture was pretty much a vampire movie. And this newer project that I was working on was going to be more of a kind of a gangster movie centered on this hitman who works for the mob, but it was going to be pretty violent and pretty dark. It was going to have some horror elements, but a very different kind of a thing than the vampire world. But we never really, there was all these stops and starts, and things never really worked out, and kind of went back and forth, and was drawn out for a really long time. And then I got into, other projects, and I kind of forgot about it for a while. And then when I started Quantum, I always, even during that time where I wasn't really focused on doing this next project, I had this deep desire to work on films again, because it's I noticed I started becoming more obsessed with the whole idea around it, and I got more and more of an influence from lots of films that I was checking out and falling in love with. And I realized with Quantum, it became this thing of suddenly over a couple of years, this was fulfilling that need, because I was taking all of my influences from film and the love that was growing even more and more with each year of film, and I was kind of taking that passion and dumping it into the band Quantum, and suddenly I came to this realization where I was like, oh wait, I'm satisfying that need of being a filmmaker, doing it in a very different way, kind of an unconventional way, but suddenly it was fulfilling that outlet. And the desire to actually become or do more films or be a filmmaker is something I just not really interested in. I have lost any kind of interest in doing it, because I felt, well, this project, this band fulfills that need, because it's kind of inspired by a lot of the same things. I'm able to, put in a lot of the ingredients that I, certain things that I learn about films, and all the technical things that are about film that that are involved with films, from the aesthetics and direction and cinematography. I take all of those things that I'm very much attracted to and put them into the music of what we do, and also the visual ideas of what we do. And so that to me is it's a little bit of a weird kind of thing, but to me it just totally satisfies that desire. So yeah, so it's interesting. So always an interesting trajectory on how things, or how things, the path that someone finds themselves on, and when you get to a place of where you have this desire, but you're like, I'm not sure. I'm just going to be open to see where things go, and I'm just going to kind of ride this wave and see where it leads. And that's kind of what I did as far as my filmmaking journey, and it kind of led into this, slightly strange area, but I, but at the end of the day, I feel very fulfilled by that. So, yeah, very interesting. So today's show is going to be about a movie that was probably the first movie I ever saw, first horror movie that I ever saw as a kid, and it was definitely a movie I saw. It was definitely a product of my childhood, and it was a movie I saw regularly, like at a regular basis. I used to always rent it on VHS, and then eventually, when HBO and cable came about, it was in syndication, and it was on TV quite a bit. But it was a movie that I used to see pretty regularly as a kid. And then about 3 years ago, I bought this on Blu-ray, and when I first saw it in the store, I couldn't believe it. I was just like, oh my god, this movie was such a part of my childhood. And that is 1988's The Unholy, starring Ben Cross. This movie is definitely the epitome of cheesy horror exploitation 101. I mean, it's so terrible and it's so bad. Like, watching it now as an old man, it's pretty unbelievable. Like, I think about how many times I saw this film as a kid, but yet at the same time, it's funny because the rough aspects of this film, as far as like the datedness, the dated quality of the film, and the practical effects and certain other things that are just like, in some respects, are just like god awful. But then just the sheer campiness and ridiculousness of the movie, uh, and the movie is much, when I watch it now, it's way more comical. Um, it kind of makes me fall in love with the movie even more, even though now I can. At the time, I just loved it because it was a pretty, wild, horror movie at the time, because of what it was about, the sexual content of the movie, and seeing it as a kid, it really fascinated me. But watching as an adult, I realized just how terrible it is and how schlocky it is. And it plays much more out like a comedy to me now. But in that regard, it almost makes me love this movie even more. And the fact that it's got a Blu-ray release uh, is just astounding to me. The other thing too about this movie, why I feel it was kind of an integral part of my youth, and it was something that I used to watch all the time. This this was the very first horror movie I ever saw that had that was related to like the occult. This was the very first movie where, particularly around, subjects, even though in some regards it has nothing to do with the actual philosophy or practice or religious aspect of it. The aesthetically it does, and it has that kind of taboo around it, and a little bit of that, the flavorings of the darkness around it. But particularly around like Satanism, it really was the first film I ever saw that was a full-on horror movie. It had all of this like sexual imagery, but it was about these people who were supposed Satanists. And this was the first horror movie. Before that, watching horror films, it was usually, growing up, it was usually either, monster movies, like Universal monster movies, but then it was also the slasher genre, which I grew up watching, and that was a deep, love of mine. And, some films that had a supernatural element, but this was the first movie that had, it was about like, at least at that time, I thought was about like the occult and Satanism. So this was like the first movie I ever saw as a kid that had those elements, and then ever since then, I, became obsessed with films that had that element to it, that kind of aesthetic. Um, Dealing with, images of like human sacrifice and images around, naked altars and demons and just, all kinds of images that were, at that time especially, were pushing the envelope. This was interesting too because during the 80s, there was this whole thing that came out. There was a whole slew. This was one of the, this movie was somewhat successful. From what I gather and from what I've read, it has, this disc has an amazing amount of special features, really great. But this movie came out during that decade in the 80s. Like, this came out in 88, and this came out in the 80s during the, what is most well known as the Satanic Panic. The Panic was probably, it took place in the 80s, and it lasted for quite a few years. And, I look back at that period as being probably one of the darkest periods in American history as far as censorship, and also the, we were facing as a nation the real prospect that, certain religious practices could have been and would have been outlawed, particularly people who practice, quote unquote, alternative religious lifestyles. And basically, it was all centered around this craze that was perpetrated by the right wing Christian fundamentalists, of where there were all of these reported stories of human sacrifice, kids being kidnapped and murdered and used as human sacrifices. And there were all of these cases of, supposed cases of kids disappearing, and that there were all of these like supposed satanic cults that were spread out. And there was like this network of these like groups of practitioners who had this, kind of grand conspiracy of basically, taking over the entire country, and turning it into this like satanic, environment or society. And this was all perpetrated by, the Christian fundamentalists. And when actual investigation was done to, into these alleged crimes, it was all dismissed as just, a media frenzy, and it was all BS when it came down to the actual investigation. And at one point, things got so heightened that there was legislation that was brought about in Congress that were, they had put these Christian sects, or this right wing Christian fundamentalist organization and organizations had put so much pressure on the government at one point because of all of these, outlandish claims, that there was a bill actually in the works that would have actually outlawed, quote unquote, people who practice, Satanism, or people who practiced various other forms of the occult, but particularly around Satanism. And it was during the time when Geraldo Rivera was a talk show host, Sally Jesse Raphael. There was a whole bunch of them. Oprah Winfrey. And they would have all of these supposed guests of people who, had witnessed these events or escaped them, or they'd have all of these specialists of all of these guys who made millions of dollars off of writing books on just complete bullshit. And then they would also have members of the Church of Satan actually on the show, basically defending and saying, well, and the Church of Satan, for people who are not aware of, that was it's the only recognized, or really recognized, significant church that is based on Satanism. And they would have a lot of these specialists on there to try to counterbalance this argument and to kind of give some kind of levity to this craze that, you know, these things were just complete lies and complete fabrications. And a lot of their focus of their argument was that, well, if any of these folks or any of these people who believe these claims actually read the Satanic Bible, you know, God forbid they read these books, and most of them probably couldn't even read anything anyway. But if they actually read the book, they would realize that, well, there is no such thing. That's completely invented by Hollywood. There is no such thing as human sacrifice. And if anything, children and animals are, you know, the most cherished things in that religion. So, you know, they're looked at as almost like godheads. So they're looked at as the most beautiful aspects of nature. So the idea of like killing them is completely asinine and has nothing to do with Satanism or using sacrifices. So, you know, this whole thing led to, obviously it was reflected in Hollywood, and to a degree I think this movie, it's an exploitation movie. You know, it came out in 1988, kind of like in the middle, the tail end of the slasher exploitation horror world that was going on. You know, like the exploitation world kind of started in, you know, the late 60s or so, was really, really strong and throughout the 70s, throughout that entire decade, and then hit this apex like in the early 80s, between like, you know, probably the height of the whole horror exploitation world was like 70, 75, 76 to about, 80, 87. So it was a good 10 to 12 years where the whole like horror exploitation world and exploitation in general just exploded, and it was like this big market. And during the time of grindhouse cinemas, where people were actually going to theaters, to drive-ins, they'd pay a ticket and you'd go in and you'd see like 3 or 4 movies, on the same bill. It was, a huge thing. And obviously Hollywood and a lot of filmmakers tried to capitalize on this whole like crazy sensation that was going on with the Satanic Panic. And I definitely think that this movie, The Unholy, was part of that. This was definitely one of those movies that portrayed those stereotypes of what the Satanic Panic was about. Which is not good in a lot of ways, or terrible. But at the same time, it led to, some really kick-ass movies. Even though this movie, if you look at Satanism as a religion and you look at this film, yeah, it's got the aesthetics. Aesthetics are very much a part of Satanism, and Satanism is also about, having the freedom to express yourself, having the freedom to explore, various taboos, ways of thinking that, and also outlooks on life, exploring these things that are considered not to be, conventional or outside of, societal norms. I feel like Satanism is about that exploration and questioning things. So, and it has the dark aesthetic. There is ritual aspects to Satanism, but it's essentially an atheistic worldview. It looks at all of the ritualistic aspects that are used in the COS, the Church of Satan, as pure like metaphor, psychodrama, and that mythology is, a real integral part to who we are, and it celebrates that, but it doesn't go beyond that as to saying that there are these literal demons or figures. It's all metaphor, and again, it's like the core of it is atheistic. So, like, as far as like what does this movie have any of those real qualities? Sure, I think some of the aesthetics, the taboos that are in this movie, it does. But outside of that, it's all Hollywood, and I've always thought that. So, but that being said, this movie like I said in the beginning of the show, this was my first introduction to seeing, a quote unquote satanic oriented horror film. And ever since then, I started seeking out as many films in this style that I could. And I've been buying quite a few movies that are dealing with this kind of subject matter, but in the horror exploitation world. And I just love this movie. The cool thing about this movie and this collection in particular, it's really a great collection, are the special features. One of the most fascinating interviews on here is with the some of the folks that were involved in the effects and creature designs. And again, like I said, the monster and the creature, the demon designs in this film are just, on one hand, they're just amazing and just like so outrageous, and on the other hand, they're just like so awful and probably, if you look at it for face value, probably some of the worst effects ever conceived for a movie. But at the same time, it's just got it has such a schlocky element that I just love it. I just think it's a great balance, and it's hilarious. And there's a really great documentary, an interview with the original effects guy who was on this show, who was involved with this movie, Jerry McCluso, and he was hired. There's a really just a fast. It's probably the special features on here are really great, but my favorite one is the interview with Jerry McCluso, because he talks about his experience working on this production and how kind of a disaster it was and how disorganized it was, and there was a lot of interference with the studio and just all these things that happened, in particular what happened to him. He was hired for this job. This was his first gig, and he was really young. He was actually like, I think he was like 16 or 17, Jerry McCluso, and he had done real small little stints of effects for, like, I think, short little movies, and he also did like some music videos. But this was his first big breakthrough working on a Hollywood movie, even though this movie was incredibly low budget. This was like his big break, he felt, and they basically hired him, and he basically dove into the whole situation, not knowing anything as to how he was going to do it. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to try to model some of the creatures off of Ridley Scott's Alien, because, and also, in particularly, they wanted to basically rip off the creature design from Alien, the first one, directed by Ridley Scott, and then in particularly they really wanted to model it after the Queen alien concept that was a part of Aliens, which was the sequel to Aliens, and that was directed by James Cameron. So they had set out, and again, this is another reason why I totally consider this to be an exploitation movie. Both of those movies, Alien and Aliens, were huge, commercial box office movies, legendary movies, and they really wanted to try to capitalize and basically rip it off, but they just didn't have the budget, like, with what they had with 20th Century Fox and Aliens. So the design was just like really awful, and they designed all of these effects. Jerry McCluso designed all of these effects, and eventually he got fired. And he talks about it really openly and candidly in this interview. And all of his work got cut out of the movie, and then they brought in another effects guy right before the movie actually was put out for a theatrical release. This guy Bob Keane, who eventually reshot all of the effects, and he didn't realize until he saw the movie. When he went to the premiere, Jerry McCluso, he went to the actual premiere of the movie and realized that all of his work was cut out, and he wasn't even given credit. And he was kind of screwed by this company. But it's a really interesting story to see how this guy went into this, completely foreign territory with just a lot of passion, but didn't really know how to pull off any of these things. And then how he got basically fired and canned. Uh, just it's a fascinating story, and I love the thing that I love about it is that just how candid he is and open about it, and how the industry, the film industry itself is can be so incredibly brutal and harsh, and it's a really big example of that. And the big star of this film was Ben Cross. Ben Cross was a really popular actor at one point. He was in Chariots of Fire, which was nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards. He was a real Ben Cross is was a or he's still alive, but a real famous English stage and film actor for many years. Um, long career, long career. He was part of the Royal Shakespeare Company for many years too, which is just wild. Chariots of Fire was like a multiple. That was a massive movie that won multiple Academy Awards, Oscar nominations, and it won a bunch of awards at the same time. Uh, he was in the Bride's Head Revisited with Jeremy Irons. The Citadel, which was a real famous BBC television show. The Far Pavilions. Yeah, I mean, he was a pretty legendary actor in that time, particularly around Chariots of Fire, because that was huge. That was a huge, uh, movie at the time, a big budget Hollywood movie. And here he was doing this, really terrible, schlocky, cheeseball horror movie in the late 80s, which I just thought was so funny. But it's interesting, the interview with Ben Cross is, he looks back at this movie, he looks back at the Unholy as being like he's pretty proud of it, even though he knows at face value it was, it's not a quality movie really, in regards to like his other work that he had been involved in. But it's super interesting. It's super interesting. I always find it really fascinating, particularly around, um, the actors and people that have been involved in the films that are part of the exploitation world, and seeing where their careers have gone. There was a movie that I did few weeks ago called Midnight, directed by John Russo, which is such an awesome horror exploitation movie. And that movie stars Lawrence Tierney, who was a pretty famous actor. He was like a legitimate actor in Hollywood at one point, and was a big name. And he was most notably known for his role in Reservoir Dogs by Quentin Tarantino. That was the first movie I had ever seen him in, but he was in, when he was younger, he was in a whole bunch of like gangster movies, bigger Hollywood movies. And when I had gotten Midnight, which I had never seen that film before, and I had heard about it, that it was this, kind of legendary piece of trash in the exploitation world. And when I saw that he was actually in this movie, I was like, wow, like I couldn't believe that he was, a part of that world. Like, it's just wild, just wild. Always interesting, always interesting. The other cast, there's some really other terrific actors in this. Ned Beatty is in this film for a brief point, and I mean, just he's amazing. Hal Holbrook is also in this film. Um, so you just never know. I'm again, like, I'm always surprised by certain actors that are bigger names that have have spent like a little bit of had a little stint in the world of exploitation. It's always pretty fascinating to me when you discover that, and you're like, oh wait, these guys, maybe they were having a tough time in their career, or maybe when they started out. This movie was also directed by an Italian director, Camillo Vila. He did, The Unholy, which came out in 1980, City of Gardens in 2011, Unlawful Passage and Options, 5th of July. Um, sorry, Camilo Valo is from Cuba. So he made a whole bunch of movies uh, mostly pretty low budget films for a very long time. And again, it's like one of those things you discover a particular director, and you're like, oh wait, he did this movie, he did that movie. Most of the other films that he did were kind of outside of the exploitation world, but pretty fascinating. Um, he made movies all the way up into the 2000s, which is pretty interesting. And the transfer of this movie again, like this was a movie of my childhood, and I used to always watch it on like, this. I mean, the cover is just amazing, and uh, the this was one of those movies when I was a kid. I was sold on the artwork. I mean, it's like the packaging is just awesome. Um, and going down the aisles as a kid, and I would see this on in the rows, and I'd be just like, oh my god, this looks so awesome and amazing. It's called the Unholy. That looks scary, and so always would rent it on VHS. I don't know how many times I used to see this film on VHS, and then eventually I saw it on cable. It was for a while. It was in syndication on cable, but for the most part, the quality was pretty bad. Like the actual quality of the picture and the sound. But buying it on Blu-ray, I was just blown away, and the quality of the transfer to where they transferred the original negative to the film to this the Blu-ray format is just spectacular. Like it's literally like watching it for the first time, and I feel like this is definitely one of the best like occult oriented exploitation movies that came out in the late '80s, and it was right. And I would say that this was one of the last movies that I kind of qualify as like the exploitation world. The super schlocky nature of all those films. After this, there were obviously other films that came out, but this was kind of the tail end of all of those movies coming out, and this was definitely one. This was definitely a staple of my horror diet as a kid, and I still love this movie. I actually, as many all the negative things I've said about this film, I actually appreciate this movie even more now that I own it, and just awesome. So if you're in a mood for something completely absurd and ridiculous but super entertaining, 1988's The Unholy with starring Ben Cross. Um, a super cool movie. It's super cheesy. It's pretty sleazy. Super low budget. The effects are pretty terrible. The atmosphere is actually really good. And the other thing that's always surprising to me is it's got some incredibly talented actors in it. So it has a cool balance of like some quality to it. Uh, and but it's like the epitome of just really bad '80s horror exploitation. So great. This is Jason Dean. So thanks again. If you like this channel, please like and subscribe to it, and we will see you next time. Peace.